The first shot split the night like lightning, dropping Jake Mason dead before he could scream. 5 more rustlers froze in their tracks, moonlight gleaming off their sweaty faces. Another crack pierced the darkness. Another man fell. The shots came from nowhere and everywhere, each one finding its mark with demonic precision. 300 yards away, in pitch darkness, no man should shoot like that. "He ain't human," Bert Kendrick screamed as a bullet took his ear clean off. They'd picked the wrong ranch to raid, and now hell itself seemed to rain lead from above. Only one man in all of Texas could shoot like this, the legendary Union Army sharpshooter they called Hawkeye. Before they could retreat, another shot rang out, promising death would find them all before dawn. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. James Hawkeye Morrison stood at his porch as dawn painted the Texas sky blood red. His weathered hands cradled the custom Sharps rifle like a lover, the metal still warm from his morning practice. 500 yards out, 6 bottles lay shattered, each one shot through dead center. He hadn't missed a single target in 15 years, not since Gettysburg. The ranch hands called him a legend behind his back. To his face they called him Sir, with a respect earned not just by his aim, but by the fairness with which he treated every man who worked his land. Shadow Creek Ranch had prospered under his steady hand these past 7 years, since he'd traded his blue uniform for ranch clothes and his sergeant's stripes for a rancher's brand. His eyes, sharp as ever at 45, scanned the horizon. You see, war had taught him that peace was merely the quiet before the bullets flew. Every morning he practiced. Every morning he remembered the lessons written in blood on 100 battlefields. A man's skill was only as good as his discipline. Young Tommy, barely 17 and eager as a pup, came running up the path. "Mr. Morrison, just finished feeding the horses like you asked." He paused, eyes fixed on the distant bottles. "Ain't never seen shooting like yours, sir. My pa says you was the best shot in the whole Union Army." Morrison's weathered face cracked a slight smile. "Your pa talks too much, boy." But the kid wasn't wrong. During the war, they'd called him the Ghost of Gettysburg. Confederate officers learned to fear the crack of his rifle, never knowing which shadow held their death. "Tell Cookie to ring the breakfast bell," Morrison said, his voice carrying the gravel of command. "And Tommy?" The boy turned back. "Check the south fence line today. Something ain't right out there." As Tommy scampered off, Morrison's fingers traced the notches on his rifle's stock. Each mark told a story. Each one represented a life taken in war or peace. He didn't notch the rifle for pride. Each groove was a reminder that killing, even when necessary, carried a weight a man had to bear. Inside his cabin, maps of the county spread across a solid oak table. Reports of rustlers had been increasing, moving closer to Shadow Creek with each raid. 3 neighboring ranches hit in the past month. The sheriff, a good man but overwhelmed, could do little more than write reports and make promises. Morrison knew better than to rely on promises. He'd spent the last week fortifying Shadow Creek, positioning men at key points, establishing clear fields of fire. The ranch hands thought him paranoid, but they'd never seen what he'd seen. Never watched good men die because they weren't prepared. Man earns his peace, Morrison thought as he strapped on his gun belt, and sometimes keeping that peace meant being ready for war. Shadow Creek Ranch sprawled across 5,000 acres of Texas's finest grazing land. The main house stood proud on a rise overlooking vast pastures where 2,000 head of prime Texas longhorns grazed under the watchful eyes of Morrisons and cowboys. The property had earned its name from the deep creek that cut through it like a black snake, providing water even in the driest summers. Cookie's breakfast bell rang out across the morning air, calling in the hands from their early chores. The scent of frying bacon and fresh biscuits drifted from the cookhouse, mixing with the earthy smell of cattle and sage. 20 men made their way to the long tables, their spurs jingling with each step. Old Pete, the foreman Morrison had hired, fresh from the Confederate Army, supervised the morning meal with military precision. "You boys eat quick," he barked. "We got 300 head to move to the north pasture before this heat sets in." Morrison watched his men from the cookhouse door. Each one had been carefully chosen, not just for their skill with cattle, but for their loyalty and steady nerves. Some, like Pete, were former soldiers, men who understood discipline and the importance of following orders without question. Others were young bucks like Tommy, eager to learn and prove themselves. The ranch's success hadn't come easy. Morrison had poured every dollar from his army pension and bounty hunting days into the land, building something that would last. The massive barn, painted blood red, housed 30 of the finest horses in the county. The bunkhouse, clean and well-maintained, gave his men a proper home. Even the corrals were built with extra care, the wood thick and sturdy enough to hold the meanest bull. "Trouble brewing, boss?" Pete asked quietly, coming to stand beside Morrison. The old foreman had an instinct for reading his employer's moods. "Maybe," Morrison replied, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon. "Word from town is the Hernandez ranch got hit last night. 40 head stolen, 1 hand shot dead." Pete spat tobacco, juice into the dust. "Getting bold, these rustlers. Time was, they'd just grab a few strays, run off quick. Now they're killing folks." "Times are changing, Pete. War left too many men with nothing but their guns and bad intentions." Morrison's hand unconsciously touched the rifle at his side. "Had Doc Matthews in here yesterday, warning me about strange tracks near his property. Line. Said he heard shots in the night. Doc's place ain't but 3 miles from here," Pete noted, his voice grave. "You think they're working their way toward us?" "I think they're testing boundaries, seeing who'll fight back." Morrison's jaw set hard. "They'll learn Shadow Creek ain't some easy target." The morning wore on, sun climbing higher in the Texas sky. Morrison rode out with his men, watching as they moved the cattle with practiced efficiency. The Longhorns were his pride, each one bearing the Shadow Creek brand, a lightning bolt striking a crescent moon. He'd bred them for size and temperament, creating a herd that brought top dollar at the Kansas railheads. But it wasn't just the cattle that made Shadow Creek special. Morrison had built something rare in this wild corner of Texas, a place where law and order meant something. His men were paid fair wages, treated with respect, and expected to live up to his standards. No drinking on the job, no fighting, no trouble in town. In return, they had job security and a boss who'd back them against any threat. As the day progressed, Morrison couldn't shake the feeling of eyes watching from the distant hills. He'd developed this sense during the war, an instinct that had saved his life more times than he could count. Something was coming. The peace of Shadow Creek was about to be tested. The tracks told a story Morrison didn't like. 3 riders moving quiet-like through Shadow Creek's south pasture, their horses' hooves wrapped in burlap to muffle sound. He crouched in the morning dew, his fingers tracing the indentations in the soft earth. "Found something else, boss," Tommy called from behind a stand of mesquite. The boy emerged holding a spent cartridge, Winchester 4440. "Still smells of powder, can't be more than a day old." Morrison took the cartridge, turning it in the early light. Clean, well-maintained weapon, not the work of common thieves. These were professionals, methodical in their planning, the kind of men who'd killed for less than what his cattle would bring at market. "Tommy, ride back to the ranch. Tell Pete I want extra men on the night watch, 2-man patrols. No one rides alone." Morrison's voice carried the steel of command. "And boy, keep your rifle loaded." As Tommy galloped off, Morrison continued his inspection. The tracks led to the creek, then vanished, a old Army Scout's trick he knew well. They'd used the water to cover their trail, but he spotted where they'd emerged, 1/2 a mile downstream, heading toward the canyon lands that marked Shadow Creek's western boundary. Back at the ranch, activity hummed with nervous energy. Word had spread about the tracks, about the rustlers hitting neighboring spreads. Men checked their weapons with extra care, tested saddle cinches twice before mounting up. Old Pete organized the patrols while Morrison studied his maps. The canyon lands offered 100 hiding places, natural corrals where stolen cattle could be held before being moved north to Kansas or south to Mexico. He'd used similar terrain during the war, when every shadow could hide a sharpshooter. Might be time to send word to the sheriff, Pete suggested, but his tone said he knew better. Morrison shook his head. Sheriff's spread too thin already. Besides, by the time he gathered a posse, these boys would be long gone. He traced a finger along the mapped canyon routes. No, we handle this ourselves. As dusk approached, Morrison positioned his men carefully. Double guards at the corrals, riders patrolling the creek line, spotters on the high ground with clear fields of fire. The ranch turned into an armed camp, every man knowing his post and purpose. In his cabin, Morrison cleaned his sharps with practiced precision. Each component checked, oiled and tested. The ritual calmed him, focused his mind like it had before every major engagement during the war. The rifle had never failed him, and he'd never failed to hit what he aimed at. A knock at the door broke his concentration. "Come in." It was Sarah Matthews, the doctor's daughter, her face pinched with worry. "Mr. Morrison, Pa sent me. 2 more dead hands found at the Carson place. Shot in the back while checking fence lines." Morrison's jaw tightened. Carson's ranch lay just east of Shadow Creek, the closest yet. "When?" "This morning. Pa said—" She hesitated, twisting her hands in her skirt. "Pa said they were executed, killed up close, made to kneel first." The information settled like lead in Morrison's gut. This wasn't about stealing cattle anymore. This was about sending a message, about instilling fear. He'd seen similar tactics during the war, systematic terror used to break people's will to resist. "Thank you, Miss Matthews. Tell your father to keep his shotgun loaded and his doors locked." He stood, walking her to the door. "And Sarah, if you hear shooting tonight, get your family into the root cellar and stay there." After she left, Morrison stepped onto his porch, watching the sun sink behind the canyon walls. The evening air carried the sweet scent of blooming sage, mixed with the metallic tang of an approaching storm. Weather moving in would make tracking harder, visibility poor. Perfect conditions for men with bad intentions. He could feel it in his bones, the same tension he'd felt before major battles. Tonight would bring blood to Shadow Creek, one way or another. The only question was whose blood it would be. The moon hung fat and yellow over Shadow Creek when the first shot cracked through the night. Morrison was already moving, Sharp's rifle in hand, before the echo died away. The sound had come from the south corrals, exactly where he'd expected. Trouble. Thunder rolled in the distance, but Morrison knew the difference between nature's voice and gunfire. 3 more shots rang out, followed by the panicked bawling of cattle. Through his spyglass, he could make out dark shapes moving among the herd, trying to spook them into a run. "Steady," he whispered to Tommy, who'd been assigned to his position. "Let them think they've surprised us." The Rustlers worked with practiced efficiency, cutting out a group of prime steers. Morrison counted at least 8 men, more than he'd expected. They'd waited for the storm, using the weather to mask their approach. Smart, professional, dangerous. A flash of lightning illuminated the scene. Morrison's finger tightened on the trigger. 300 yards, a shot he could make in his sleep. The Sharps roared, the report mixing with a thunderclap. Through the gunsmoke he saw one rider pitch backward off his horse. "Jesus," Tommy breathed. "In this light, signal the others," Morrison ordered, already adjusting his aim. Pattern 3. Lanterns began appearing across the ranch, exactly where Morrison had positioned his men. The Rustlers found themselves caught in a crossfire, their carefully planned raid turning into a trap. Another shot from Morrison's rifle took down a second rider. The remaining Rustlers scattered, firing wildly into the darkness. Their leader distinguished by his pale duster, wheeled his horse around. "Pull back!" His voice carried on the wind. "Pull back to the canyon!" Morrison had a clean shot at the leader, but held his fire. Something about the voice nagged at his memory, a ghost from his past he couldn't quite place. Instead, he put a bullet through the man's hat, a warning and a message. Next time, the shot would be lower. The rustlers retreated in disarray, leaving behind their dead and wounded. As rain began to fall, Morrison and his men secured the cattle and approached the fallen riders. The first was dead, Morrison's bullet having found his heart. The second lived, though the wound in his shoulder would never heal right. "Get him." "To the barn," Morrison ordered, "and fetch Doc Matthews." He knelt beside the wounded man, whose eyes widened in recognition and fear. You're him, the ghost of Gettysburg." Blood bubbled at the corners of his mouth. "He said you'd gone soft, turned rancher. Said you'd lost your edge." Morrison's hand shot out, gripping the man's shirt. "Who said? Who's leading you?" But the rustler just laughed, a wet, choking sound. "You'll find out soon enough. He's got plans for you, Hawkeye. Special plans for the man who killed his brother." Lightning flashed again, illuminating the cruel smile on the dying man's face. In that instant, Morrison felt the weight of his past bearing down like an avalanche. Someone from the war had found him, someone with a score to settle. The raid wasn't about cattle. It was about drawing him out. The storm broke in earnest, rain washing blood into the Texas soil. Morrison stood, his mind already calculating angles, positions, defenses. The war had found him again, and Shadow Creek was about to become a battlefield. Dawn broke over Shadow Creek, revealing the night's violence in harsh detail. The dead rustler lay covered by a blanket, while Doc Matthews worked on the wounded one in the barn. Morrison stood at his usual spot on the porch. But this morning, there were no practice shots. His sharps rested against the rail as he read the note Tommy had found pinned to the corral post with a knife. "To the ghost of Gettysburg," it read, in careful script. "You took something from me at Antietam. Now I'm going to take everything from you, one piece at a time. Your cattle, your men, your reputation. When you've lost it all, when you're broken and begging, then I'll grant you the mercy of a bullet. You remember Antietam, don't you? September 17th, 1862, the day you killed my brother from 600 yards away. He was just a boy carrying water to the wounded, but you couldn't tell that through your scope, could you, Hawkeye?" Morrison's hands tightened on the paper, memories flooding back. Antietam, the bloodiest day of the war. He'd taken dozens of shots that day, each one recorded in his spotter's log. But that particular shot... His stomach turned as the memory surfaced, a figure running through the smoke, something glinting in his hands. He'd assumed it was a weapon. "Sheriff's here," Pete announced, breaking Morrison's reverie. Sheriff Wilson rode up looking like he hadn't slept in days. His deputy, young Bill Hayes, followed on a nervous horse. "Heard there was trouble, James. 3 dead at the Wilkins place last night, too. Same gang?" Morrison handed him the note. "This isn't about cattle anymore, Tom. This is personal." The sheriff read quickly, his face growing grave. "James, I got 2 deputies in a county bigger than some states. I can't—" "I'm not asking for help," Morrison cut him off. "I'm warning you. Keep your men clear of Shadow Creek. This is going to get worse before it gets better." Inside the barn, Doc Matthews emerged from treating the wounded rustler. "He'll live," the doctor reported, wiping blood from his hands, "though he might wish. Otherwise, bullets shattered his shoulder. He'll never use that arm again." "Did he say anything else?" Morrison asked, between screams. "Just kept muttering about the colonel and something about bases in the Canyonlands." Matthews shook his head. "Seems mighty organized for ordinary rustlers." Morrison nodded slowly. The pieces were falling into place. A military man seeking revenge, using the chaos of the frontier to mask his true purpose. The cattle raids were just a cover, a way to build a force without drawing attention from the army or federal marshals. "Tom," he turned to the sheriff, That army patrol still camping near Fort Griffin? Left 2 weeks ago, Wilson replied. Won't be another until spring. Perfect timing, Morrison thought. No military presence, local law enforcement overwhelmed, ranchers isolated and vulnerable. A tactical strategy worthy of a Confederate officer. Tommy burst into the barn, out of breath. Mr. Morrison, riders coming in from the east. It's Mrs. Carson, she's hurt bad. They rushed outside to find Sarah Carson barely conscious in her saddle, blood staining her dress. Doc Matthews caught her as she slumped forward. They burned everything, she whispered before fainting. Said to tell Hawkeye. Said this is just the beginning. Morrison's face hardened into the mask his men had seen only once before, when Rustlers had killed a young ranch hand last spring. Pete, get the men ready. Full ammunition, 3 days provisions. Tommy, ride to town, tell every ranch hand and farmer you see. Shadow Creek's offering sanctuary. Anyone who wants protection, bring your families here. You're turning the ranch into a fortress, the sheriff observed. No, Morrison's voice was cold as steel. I'm setting a trap. The colonel wants to play soldier? Fine. Let's see how he likes facing a prepared enemy for a change. As his men rushed to follow orders, Morrison returned to his cabin. From beneath his bed, he pulled an old wooden chest. Inside lay his blue uniform, still stained with the mud of a dozen battlefields. Beneath it, wrapped in oiled cloth, rested his spotter's log from the war. He opened it to September 17, 1862, and began to read. He needed to remember everything about that day at Antietam, about the shot that had set this blood feud in motion. The war wasn't over, not really. It had just been waiting, festering like an untreated wound. Now it had followed him to Texas, threatening everything and everyone he'd come to care about. But this time, he wasn't a soldier bound by orders and regulations. This time, he'd fight his own way. Shadow Creek transformed over the next 3 days. Under Morrison's direction, the ranch became an armed camp, every approach covered, every weakness addressed. He drew on all his military experience, turning the natural features of the land into defensive positions. The barn became an arsenal, boxes of ammunition stacked alongside hay bales. Morrison had been preparing for trouble. He just hadn't known what kind until now. His men dug rifle pits at key points, concealed shooting positions that could cover the main approaches. The creek itself became a defensive line, its steep banks offering natural protection. Like building a fort, Pete commented, watching Morrison direct the placement of sharpened stakes along the creek bed. Reminds me of Petersburg. Different kind of war here, Morrison replied, checking the stake angles, but same principles. Control the ground, control the fight. Word spread fast across the county. By sunset of the first day, 5 families had arrived seeking shelter. By the second day, the number had grown to 12. Morrison welcomed them all, assigning the men to defensive positions and settling the women and children in the main house. Through it all, Morrison's mind worked on the puzzle of the colonel's identity. The Rustlers' words haunted him. He's got plans for you. The Antietam connection narrowed it down. Not many Confederate officers had lost brothers that day. He spent evenings poring over his war journals, trying to piece together the mystery. Tommy proved invaluable, riding circuit between neighboring ranches, gathering intelligence. They're moving men into the canyons, he reported on the 3rd morning. Local boys say they've counted maybe 40 riders, some wearing old Confederate uniforms. Morrison nodded grimly. A proper military force, then, not just rustlers playing soldier. He'd seen the type before, men who couldn't let go of the war, who carried their hatred like a religious crusade. What about the colonel? Morrison asked. Any description? Tall man, they say, rides a big grey horse, wears a black duster and keeps his left arm in a sling. Tommy hesitated. One thing everyone mentions, got a scar running down his face, like somebody tried to split his head with a saber. Morrison's blood ran cold. The description struck a chord, a memory from late in the war. A Confederate officer who'd led a desperate charge at Cold Harbor, taking a Union cavalry saber to the face, but fighting on. They'd never learned his name, but his ferocity had become legendary. "Sir?" Tommy noticed Morrison's expression. "You know him?" "Maybe." Morrison turned to study his maps again. "Get some rest, boy. Tomorrow's going to be busy." That night, Morrison called his key men together in the main house. The families had been moved to the root cellar, leaving the ground. Floor clear for planning. Maps covered the big oak table, weighted down with coffee cups and ammunition boxes. "They'll come in force," Morrison explained, tracing likely attack routes. "The colonel's a proper military man. He'll have scouts, flanking elements, probably even artillery if he's been planning this long enough." Artillery? Pete looked skeptical. "Out here?" "Mountain howitzers," Morrison said. "Light enough to move through rough country, powerful enough to breach walls. Army surplus, sold cheap after the war. I've had reports of some gone missing from Fort Griffin's arsenal." He outlined his defense plan, positioning his most experienced men at crucial points. The ranch hands who'd served in the war nodded in approval. They recognized solid tactical thinking. "What about you?" Pete asked. "Where will you be?" Morrison pointed to the highest point of the ranch, a rocky outcrop overlooking both the creek and the approach from the canyons. "I'll be there. 500 yards clear shot in every direction. Any officer worth his salt will have studied my record. He'll expect me to be mobile, moving between positions. Instead, I'm giving him what he expects to see." "You're making yourself a target," Pete protested. "That's the idea." Morrison's eyes held a cold gleam. "The colonel wants me. Everything else, the cattle raids, the attacks on other ranches, it's all been about drawing me out. So I'm giving him what he wants, on my terms." "Bait in a trap," old Jake Murphy mused, his cavalry experience showing. "But what's the trap?" Morrison allowed himself a grim smile. "The colonel's expecting the ghost of Gettysburg, the lone sharpshooter. He's not expecting 40 armed men and a fortified position. His hatred will make him reckless. When he sees me up there, he'll commit his forces to a frontal assault." The men studied the maps, seeing the killing ground Morrison had created. Every approach would funnel attackers into pre-sighted fields of fire. The creek would split their forces, preventing effective coordination. It was a deadly geometric puzzle, solved with the precision of a mathematician and the experience of a veteran soldier. As the meeting broke up, Pete lingered behind. "One thing still bothers me, boss. If this colonel's so set on revenge, why not just try to shoot you? Why all this elaborate planning?" Morrison checked his rifle's action before answering. "Because it's not just about killing me, Pete. It's about destroying everything I've built. He wants me to suffer first, to watch my world burn. That's why. He's been hitting other ranches, killing innocent people. He's trying to break my spirit before he breaks my body." "Then he doesn't know you very well," Pete said firmly. "No," Morrison agreed, his voice hard as iron. "He doesn't, and that's going to cost him everything." Martha Wilkins arrived at Shadow Creek just before sunset, her wagon piled with what little she'd salvaged from her burned-out ranch. Her face was streaked with soot and tears, her hands raw from digging through the ashes of her home. Morrison helped her down from the wagon, noting how she flinched at his touch. "They killed Thomas," she said, her voice hollow. "Made me watch. Said it was a message for you." Morrison felt the weight of guilt settle on his shoulders. Thomas Wilkins had been a good man, a peaceful farmer who'd never harmed anyone. They'd served together briefly during the war, before Thomas took a Confederate bullet at Chancellorsville and came west to heal. "Tell me everything," Morrison said gently, leading her to the kitchen where Cookie had hot coffee waiting. Martha's hands shook as she gripped the cup. "They came at midnight. 20 men, maybe more. Thomas tried to surrender, offered them in cattle, everything we had." She paused, fighting back tears. "Their leader, the one they called Colonel, he just laughed, said this wasn't about cattle." Morrison leaned forward. This colonel, what did he say exactly? He said to tell Hawkeye that every death is on his hands, that for every Confederate soldier you killed from your sniper's nest, he'd kill 10 innocent people. Her voice broke. Then he shot Thomas in the back, said it was fitting since that's how you killed his brother. Pete, standing in the doorway, spat into the dust. Ain't true, Mrs. Wilkins. Morrison never shot a man in the back, not during the war, not after. The boy at Antietam, Morrison said quietly. I didn't know he was carrying water. Through the scope in the smoke, I thought I saw a weapon. He met Martha's eyes. But that doesn't excuse what they did to Thomas. Nothing excuses that. Martha straightened in her chair. Thomas used to tell stories about you from the war, said you were the best shot in the army, but also the most honest, said you never took pleasure in killing, never shot unless you had to. She reached across the table, gripping Morrison's hand. These men, they're not soldiers. They're butchers. Thomas would want you to stop them. Morrison nodded slowly. I will, but first I need to know everything you can tell me about their setup. Numbers, weapons, horses, anything you noticed. Over the next hour, Martha provided crucial intelligence. The colonel's men were well armed with newer Winchester rifles and plenty of ammunition. They had at least 2 mountain howitzers, just as Morrison had suspected. But most importantly, she'd overheard them talking about their main camp. It's in the Box Canyon, she said. They've got some kind of underground storage there, old mining tunnels maybe. That's where they keep the stolen cattle before moving them south to Mexico. Morrison spread his maps out on the table, finding Box Canyon. It was a natural fortress, with only one narrow entrance, perfect for defense, but also a potential trap. How many men at the camp? Hard to say. They come and go. But I heard the colonel say something about expecting reinforcements. 40 more. Men coming up from Mexico. She hesitated. There's something else. They've got hostages, 3 families from the smaller ranches. Children. The room went silent. Morrison's jaw tightened as he studied the map. The situation had just become infinitely more complicated. A direct assault on Box Canyon would mean dead hostages, but waiting for reinforcements to arrive would make the colonel's force nearly unstoppable. He's copying Antietam, Morrison said finally, seeing the pattern. At Antietam, the Confederates used civilian buildings, barns, churches as cover, knew we wouldn't shell them. Now he's using hostages the same way. What are you going to do? Martha asked. Morrison rolled up his maps, his decision made. What? I should have done at Antietam. Get closer, much closer. He turned to Pete. Get me everything we have on the old mining operations in Box Canyon. If there are tunnels, they work both ways. As Martha was shown to her room, Morrison returned to his cabin. From the bottom of his war chest, he removed one last item, a Confederate officer's uniform he'd taken as a trophy. It might just be his. Ticket into Box Canyon. The colonel wasn't the only one who could play at deception. The sun set behind the canyon walls, painting the sky blood red. Tomorrow would bring more refugees, more tales of terror. But it would also bring Morrison one day closer to ending this war, one way or another. Dawn hadn't yet touched the canyon walls when Morrison led his first strike team out. 6 men, all veterans, dressed in captured Rustler gear. Tommy had spent days watching their patrol patterns, noting the changes in guard shifts. Now it would pay off. They caught the scout patrol at the narrow bend of Serpent Creek, taking them completely by surprise. 2 riders, both young and cocky, never even reached for their guns. Morrison's men had them bound and gagged before they could raise an alarm. You sure about this, boss? Pete whispered as they stripped the prisoners of their gear. Getting awful close to their main camp. Morrison checked the captured men's saddlebags, finding what he'd hoped for: coded messages, patrol routes, and most importantly, recognition signals. We need to know what we're up against. These boys are going to tell us. The prisoners were taken to an abandoned line shack 3 miles from Shadow Creek. Morrison had prepared it carefully. No windows, thick walls, nothing to give away their location. Inside, he faced the captured scouts, noting their youth and their fear. "I'm only going to ask once," he said quietly. "How many hostages, and where are they kept?" The younger scout, barely 18, broke immediately. "North end of Box Canyon. In the old mining office, 8 women, 11 children." His voice cracked. "The colonel, he makes us guard them. Says if any escape, he'll kill their menfolk first." "The colonel," Morrison pressed. "Tell me about him." The older scout, braver or more foolish, spat at Morrison's feet. "Go to hell." "Yankee," Morrison's hand moved faster than thought, catching the scout's shirt front. "Your colonel's brother, the water carrier at Antietam. Tell me his name." Something in Morrison's voice, some deadly quality, broke through the scout's bravado. "William," he stammered. "William Bedford. The colonel's brother was just a kid, serving as a water boy, 'cause their mama made the colonel promise to keep him safe." Morrison released him, memories flooding back. William Bedford. He remembered writing the name in his spotter's log, remembered the sick feeling when they found the water canteen among the boys' effects. Colonel Thomas Bedford had led the countercharge that day, nearly breaking the Union. Line in his rage. "How many men in the main camp?" Morrison continued his questioning. 37, the younger scout answered, "plus the colonel, but more coming. A whole company of former Confederates, led by Major Harrison. They're due in 3 days." Pete whistled low. "That's an army, boss." "That's the point," Morrison said grimly. "The colonel's building more than a gang. He's building a private army, using revenge as recruitment." He turned back to the scouts. "The howitzers. Where are they positioned?" The older scout had found his courage again. "You think we're going to tell you everything? The colonel will kill us?" "The colonel's not here," Morrison replied softly. "I am, and I've killed a lot more men than Thomas Bedford ever did." He let that sink in. "But you helped me save those hostages, and you ride out of this alive. Your choice." An hour later, Morrison had everything he needed. The scouts had broken completely, providing details of guard rotations, ammunition stores, and the colonel's battle plans. They'd even drawn rough maps of the camp's layout. "Keep them secure," Morrison ordered Pete as they rode back. "We'll need them when this is over. Their testimony might keep the survivors from hanging." But Pete had seen Morrison's expression, read the cold calculation in his eyes. "You're not planning on there being many survivors, are you?" "The colonel wants to recreate Antietam." Morrison's voice was winter cold. "Fine, but this time I won't be 500 yards away with a rifle. This time I'm bringing the war to him." They rode back to Shadow Creek in silence, Morrison's mind already working through the tactical problems. The hostages complicated everything, but they also provided an opportunity. The colonel would expect a frontal assault, a desperate rescue attempt. He wouldn't expect Morrison to use his own underground routes against him. As they crested the last rise before the ranch, Morrison saw Tommy riding hard to meet them. The boy's face was grave. "More refugees coming in, boss." "The colonel's men. Hit 3 more farms last night. No survivors this time." Morrison nodded slowly. "Send riders to the sheriff. Tell him to keep his men clear of Box Canyon for the next 2 days." His eyes turned to the distant cliffs where the colonel waited. "It's time to end this war, once and for all." Morrison slipped through the shadows of Copper Creek town like a ghost, wearing plain clothes instead of his usual rancher's gear. The frontier town's single street was quiet in the pre-dawn hours, but light burned in the back room of Jenkins' bank, just as his informant had said it would. Through the grimy window, he watched 3 men hunched over ledgers, Jenkins himself, Judge Harrison, and Mayor Wade. Good men, he'd thought once, pillars of the community. Now he knew better. "The colonel's offering 30 cents on the dollar," Jenkins was saying, his voice carrying through the thin glass. For every ranch we foreclose on, every property we seize after his men drive the owners off." "Risky," Judge Harrison muttered. "Morrison's causing problems. He's fortifying Shadow Creek, offering sanctuary. Morrison's a dead man." Mayor Wade laughed. "The Colonel's got something special planned for him, something about Antietam and settling old scores." Morrison's hand tightened on his rifle stock. The corruption ran deeper than he'd imagined. The town's leading citizens were in league with the Colonel, using the terror campaign to grab land cheap. They'd profit from their neighbors' deaths, build fortunes on blood money. A floorboard creaked behind him. Morrison spun, rifle ready, but it was only Tommy. The boy had insisted on coming, proving himself more valuable with each passing day. "Doc, Matthews just rode in the back way," Tommy whispered. "Says he's got news about the Colonel's reinforcements. They're not coming from Mexico." "Where then?" "Fort Griffin itself. Whole company of cavalry, supposedly deserting on schedule. The Colonel's bought himself an army." Morrison processed this new information. Regular cavalry meant better weapons, better training, but it also meant something else. Official papers, military credentials. The Colonel wasn't just building a gang. He was establishing legitimate control of the territory. He led Tommy back to their horses, mind working through the implications. The Colonel's plan was brilliant in its simplicity. Drive out the legitimate ranchers, have his conspirators. Buy the land cheap, then establish himself as the region's primary landowner. With a private army at his back, who dare challenge him? "Two more things," Tommy added as they mounted up. "Doc says the Colonel's real name is Thomas Bedford Randall. Changed it after the war, and—" The boy hesitated. "He's got a federal marshal's badge, a real one." Morrison's blood ran cold. A federal marshal could requisition supplies, demand support from local law enforcement, even call in military aid. The Colonel had built himself a perfect cover for his operation. That's why the army patrol stopped, Morrison realized. He's got someone at Fort Griffin helping him. Probably the quartermaster, maybe even the commander. They rode back toward Shadow Creek in silence, the weight of discovery heavy on their shoulders. Morrison had thought he was facing a simple revenge plot. Instead, he'd stumbled into a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial authority. Back at the ranch, Pete waited with more news. The runners he'd sent to neighboring counties had returned. Similar patterns were emerging everywhere. Mysterious foreclosures, ranchers driven off their land, properties snapped up by shadowy investors. "They're building an empire," Morrison said quietly, "using terror and corruption to steal half of Texas." "So what do we do?" Pete asked. "Can't fight the whole territory." Morrison stared at his maps, at the pins marking each attack, each foreclosure. A pattern emerged, like a noose drawing tight around Shadow Creek. His ranch was the last major holdout, the final obstacle to the Colonel's plans. "We don't have to fight the whole territory," he said finally. "Just cut off the snake's head. The Colonel dies, his whole operation falls apart. Those corrupt officials will turn on each other like wolves." "He's got hostages," Tommy reminded him, "and now a marshal's badge." Morrison's face hardened. "Badge doesn't make him bulletproof, but you're right about the hostages. We need to get them out first." He turned to his war chest, pulling out the Confederate officer's uniform. "Time to put this to use. The Colonel wants to recreate Antietam. Let's give him a ghost from his past." The betrayal came from the last person Morrison expected. Sheriff Wilson rode into Shadow Creek just past noon, his deputy Bill Hayes at his side. Nothing seemed amiss at first, just another routine visit to check on the refugees. "Got some news." "About the Colonel," Wilson said, accepting a cup of coffee in Morrison's cabin. "Thought you should hear it firsthand." Morrison was checking his rifles, laying out ammunition for the night's planned reconnaissance. "What kind of news, Tom?" "The shot came without warning." Morrison's reflexes, honed by years of combat, saved his life. He dropped and rolled as Wilson's bullet smashed into the wall behind him. Before the sheriff could fire again, Morrison had his own revolver out. but Hayes had circled behind, pressing a gun to his head. "Sorry, James." Wilson's voice held genuine regret. "Colonel's offering $20,000 for you. Alive, preferably, but dead if necessary." Morrison kept his voice steady. "How long, Tom? How long you been working for him?" "Since the beginning." Wilson holstered his gun. "You think it was accident, him choosing this territory? I helped him set it all up. Told him which ranches were vulnerable, who could be bought, who needed to be eliminated. The families you swore to protect." Morrison's voice was winter cold. "The people who trusted you." "Times are changing, James. Man's got to look to his future." Wilson nodded to Hayes. "Tie him up. Colonel wants him delivered before sundown." But Hayes never got the chance. A single shot rang out, and the deputy's head snapped back, a red hole appearing between his eyes. Wilson spun toward the window, drawing his gun, but Morrison was already moving. His fist caught the sheriff's jaw, sending him sprawling. "Drop it!" Pete's voice came from the doorway, rifle aimed steady. "Unless you want to join your deputy." Morrison retrieved Wilson's gun, then checked Hayes's body. "Good shot, Pete. Clean." Tommy spotted them acting suspicious, coming in. "Boy's got good instincts." Wilson spat blood, glaring up at them. "Doesn't matter. Colonel's men are already moving. While you've been focusing on Box Canyon, they've been surrounding the ranch. 50 men, maybe more." Morrison's mind raced. The reconnaissance mission would have taken their best fighters away from Shadow Creek, leaving it vulnerable. The sheriff's betrayal had been meant to coincide with a major attack. "Pete, sound the alarm. Get everyone to battle stations." He turned to Wilson. "How long?" "Should be hearing those howitzers any minute now." Wilson smiled through bloody teeth. As if on cue, the first shell screamed overhead, exploding near the barn. Cattle began bellowing in panic as more explosions followed. Morrison dragged Wilson to his feet. "You're coming with me," he growled. "If I'm going to lose my ranch, least I can do is make sure you don't live to spend that blood money." They stumbled out into chaos. The colonel's men had emerged from hiding, laying down heavy fire from 3 directions. Morrison's defenders returned fire from their prepared positions, but the artillery was forcing them to stay under cover. "Get the women and children to the root cellar," Morrison shouted to Tommy as they ran past, "and bring me my sharps." Pete shoved Wilson into a storage shed, quickly binding him. "What now, boss? We're surrounded, outgunned." Another shell landed close, showering them with dirt. Morrison could see his men falling back under the assault, giving ground foot by bloody foot. Everything he'd built was under attack, his carefully prepared defenses being torn apart by artillery he hadn't known about. "We can't hold them off forever," Pete said grimly. "Not with those howitzers pounding us." Morrison nodded slowly, a desperate plan forming. "No, but we can make them pay for every inch." He turned to Tommy, who'd returned with his Sharps rifle. "Remember those mining maps you found? The ones showing the old tunnels?" Tommy's eyes widened. "The ones that run under the whole valley? But you said they were too dangerous, likely to collapse. Better than dying up here." Morrison checked his ammunition. "Get our people into those tunnels. Lead them out the far end, toward the Matthews place. Pete and I will hold them here, make them think we're still defending the whole ranch." "That's suicide," Tommy protested. "No," Morrison's voice was hard as iron. "That's tactics. They'll be focused on us, won't expect an evacuation." He gripped the boy's shoulder. "Do it now! And Tommy, when you get everyone safe, find the colonel's hostages. Free them." As Tommy ran to organize the evacuation, Morrison turned to Pete. "Ready to play ghost, old friend?" Pete checked his rifle, grinning. "Just like Chancellorsville?" "Just like Chancellorsville." Morrison settled into a firing position, sighting down his sharps at the attackers. "Let's remind these boys why they used to fear sharpshooters." The sun was setting when Morrison spotted the colonel's newest cruelty through his scope. Sarah Matthews, bound and terrified, was being led to the edge of the canyon wall. Even at 600 yards, Morrison could see she'd been roughed up. her dress torn, her face bruised. "Morrison!" The colonel's voice boomed across the valley, amplified by the canyon walls. "I've got something that might interest you." Pete lowered his binoculars, swearing softly. 600 yards. Crosswind. "Fading light, even for you, boss." "Quiet," Morrison commanded, his focus absolute. He'd made shots like this before, but never with such high stakes. One mistake, one slight tremor, and Sarah would die. The colonel stood behind Sarah, using her as a shield. Only his head and shoulders were visible. "Surrender now, or the girl dies. You've got 1 minute to show yourself." Morrison's mind calculated distances, wind speed, bullet drop. The evening breeze was tricky, swirling through the canyon. The light was worse, throwing off depth perception, but he'd shot in worse conditions during the war. 30 seconds, Morrison, or I add her to your list of innocent victims." Morrison's finger tightened on the trigger. He could feel his heartbeat, slow and steady. Time seemed to stretch, the world narrowing to his scope's crosshairs. 10 seconds. The wind dropped for a moment. Morrison exhaled slowly, squeezing the trigger at the bottom of his breath, just as he had thousands of times before. The sharps roared. Through the scope, Morrison watched the colonel's head snap back, a red mist erupting as the heavy bullet found its mark. Before his body had even begun to fall, Morrison was already firing again, picking off the 2 men holding Sarah's arms. "Pete, cover fire!" Morrison was running before the words left his mouth, charging across the killing ground. Bullets whined past him as the colonel's men recovered from their shock, but Pete's accurate fire kept them ducking. Sarah had collapsed, still bound, dangerously close to the canyon's edge. Morrison reached her just as a shell exploded nearby, showering them with dirt and rocks. He cut her bonds with his knife, checking her for serious injuries. "Can you run?" She nodded, tears cutting tracks through the dust on her face. They killed Pa. The colonel shot him himself, just to prove he could." "We'll mourn later," Morrison said grimly, leading her toward the relative safety of a boulder. "Right. Now we need to move." More shells screamed in, but their accuracy was falling off as darkness approached. The colonel's men seemed disorganized without their leader, their attack losing momentum. But Morrison knew it wouldn't last. Someone would take command soon enough. They made it back to Pete's position as night fell properly. Sarah's information confirmed Morrison's worst fears. The colonel had been planning to use her execution, to draw him out, counting on his reputation for helping the innocent. The whole attack had been orchestrated around that moment. "He had it all planned," Sarah's voice shook. "Said he'd studied you for years, knew exactly how to break you. Said killing me would destroy your spirit, make you reckless." Morrison checked. "His ammunition. He wasn't the first to try using my conscience against me. During the war, Confederate snipers would wound men, leave them crying for help, trying to draw out Union sharpshooters." "Did it work?" Sarah asked. "Sometimes. Lost some good men that way. Learned to be patient, to wait for the right shot." He turned to Pete. "How's our ammunition?" "Low. Maybe 20 rounds each for the rifles. Bit more for the pistols." Morrison nodded slowly. "The colonel's dead, but his army's still out there. They'll regroup, probably pull back to Box Canyon to resupply." He studied the darkening battlefield. "That's when we hit them." "Hit them?" Pete looked incredulous. "Boss, we're down to 2 men and a few bullets." "3," Sarah interrupted. "I can shoot, but made sure all his children could handle a rifle." Morrison saw the steel in her eyes, the same determination he'd seen in young soldiers seeking revenge. "Your father was a good man, Sarah. He deserved better." "Yes, he did." She checked the revolver Morrison had given her. "So when do we start?" The sound of hooves interrupted them. Tommy appeared out of the darkness, breathing hard. "Boss, got the folks safe at the Matthews place. But there's more. Found some of the colonel's papers in his saddlebags. Plans, lists of names, evidence of everything." Morrison took the papers, reading quickly by matchlight. Names, dates, amounts paid. The entire conspiracy laid out in the colonel's own hand, enough to hang half the territory's officials. Well, Pete grinned in the darkness. Reckon that shot did more than just kill the colonel. It gave us a weapon better than bullets. Morrison nodded grimly. First we survive the night, then we'll see about justice. He turned to study the distant fires of the enemy camp. But for now, we've got work to do. The colonel might be dead, but his army's still out there. Time to remind them why they called me the Ghost of Gettysburg. In the colonel's blood-stained saddlebags, beneath the damning documents, Morrison found a weathered journal. Its pages were filled with meticulous notes about Shadow Creek, about Morrison's habits, about every shot he'd taken during the war. But it was the final entry that made his blood run cold. Found the truth at last, the colonel had written. Morrison wasn't just any Union sharpshooter, he was my own blood. My father's bastard son, born to a Union nurse he met before the war. William wasn't just carrying water that day at Antietam. He was trying to reach his half-brother, carrying a letter from our dying father. Morrison killed his own brother without ever knowing it. The journal slipped from Morrison's numb fingers. Pete picked it up, reading silently before looking at his friend with concern. "Boss?" "I remember that boy." Morrison's voice was hollow. "Something fell from his hand when he died. I thought it was a weapon, but—" He pulled out his own journal, flipping to the Antietam entry. "Here, young Confederate, approximately 15 years old, carrying unknown object, shot at 600 yards, confirmed kill." Sarah, who'd been cleaning her father's rifle, looked up. "That's why the colonel went mad with revenge. You didn't just kill his brother. You killed your own." Morrison stood abruptly, walking to the edge of their defensive position. The night wind carried the smell of gunpowder and death. Below, the colonel's men were regrouping, their campfires dotting the darkness, like fallen stars. "All these years," he said finally, "I've carried every shot with me, every life I took I recorded, not for pride, but for responsibility, to remember that each bullet changed something forever." He turned back to his companions. "But this changes everything." "No," Pete said firmly. "Changes nothing. You didn't know, couldn't have known. And even if you had, that boy was wearing Confederate gray in the middle of a battle." Tommy, who'd been keeping watch, spoke up. "Boss, riders, coming into their camp. Looks like reinforcements." Morrison shook off his shock, forcing himself back to the present crisis. The past could haunt him later. Right now, they had a war to win. "The colonel planned this," he said, studying the enemy positions. "Even in death, he made sure I'd know. Made sure the guilt would eat at me." His jaw tightened. "But he forgot something important." "What's that?" Sarah asked. "I've lived with guilt before. Learn to use it." Morrison checked his rifle. "The colonel wanted to break my spirit with this revelation. Instead, he just gave me one more reason to end this tonight." Through his scope, Morrison counted the new arrivals. At least 30 fresh. Riders, well-armed and disciplined. Former cavalry by their bearing. The colonel's army was growing even without him. "They'll attack at dawn," Pete predicted. "Classic cavalry tactic. Use the rising sun to blind defenders." Morrison nodded. "That's what they'll expect us to think. But look there. They're positioning men in the shadows. They'll come before dawn, trying to surprise us." The revelation about William still burned in his gut, a pain sharper than any bullet wound. But Morrison had learned long ago to transform pain into focus, guilt into purpose. The colonel had hoped this knowledge would destroy him. Instead, it hardened his resolve. "Pete, get our ammunition distributed." "Tommy, those mining tunnels you found, how close do they come to their camp?" Tommy's eyes lit up with understanding. "There's a shaft that comes up right behind their position. Collapsed years ago, but they won't be watching it." Morrison finished. "They think we're trapped up here, forced to fight from prepared positions." He turned to Sarah. "Your father's death, my brother's death. All part of the colonel's revenge. But now we use his obsession against his own men. In the distance, thunder rumbled. A storm was coming, just like at Antietam. Morrison allowed himself a grim smile. 15 years ago, he'd killed his brother in the rain and smoke. Tonight, he'd make sure that death meant something. Time to show them why they called me the Ghost, he said softly. And this time, we're bringing the haunting to them. Thunder crashed overhead as Morrison led his small team through the abandoned mining tunnel. The passage was barely wide enough for a man to walk upright, old support beams groaning with each step. Their lantern cast twisted shadows on walls that hadn't seen light in decades. "You sure this is safe, boss?" Pete whispered, ducking under a low-hanging beam. "Nothing about this is safe," Morrison replied. "But it's our only chance. Those reinforcements up there, they're not just any cavalry. I recognize the way they move. Texas Rangers, who turned bad after the war, professional manhunters." Sarah, bringing up the rear with Tommy, gripped her father's rifle tighter. "How many?" 30, maybe more, led by Major Harrison, meanest tracker this side of the Mississippi. Morrison paused at a junction, consulting Tommy's crude map. "Left here. Should come up right behind their camp." The tunnel took them deeper, into the earth. Water dripped from the ceiling, and the air grew thick with the smell of wet earth and old timber. Every few yards Morrison would stop, listening intently for any sign they'd been discovered. "Boss!" Tommy's voice was urgent. "Voices above!" They doused the lantern, standing in absolute darkness as boots crunched on dirt overhead. Morrison pressed his ear to the tunnel ceiling, catching fragments of conversation. "Dawn attack, just like the Major ordered. Ghost won't expect us from all sides. It'll worth double pay once we take Shadow Creek." When the voices faded, Morrison lit the lantern again. "They're planning something big, multiple assault points." He turned to his companions. "Change of plans. We're not just going to hit them, we're going to make them destroy themselves." Pete grinned in the dim light. "Got something special in mind?" "Major Harrison's men don't know the colonel's dead. They're expecting orders from him." Morrison pulled out the bundle of papers they'd recovered. "And we've got everything we need to give those orders." Understanding dawned on Tommy's face. The colonel's papers, his handwriting, his seal. Exactly. Morrison found a relatively dry spot and spread out the documents. "Pete, you served with Harrison during the war. What's his weakness?" "Gold," Pete answered without hesitation. "Man's greed is stronger than his loyalty." Morrison nodded, beginning to write in a perfect imitation of the colonel's hand. Years of copying orders during the war had taught him this particular skill. "Then let's give him something to be greedy about." The forged orders were simple but devastating. They appeared to be from the colonel, instructing Harrison to split his forces. Half would attack Shadow Creek from the east, while the other half secured a non-existent gold shipment supposedly hidden in Box Canyon. "They'll tear themselves apart fighting over imaginary gold," Sarah observed. "That's the idea," Morrison added. "The colonel's seal. Greed makes men careless, makes them forget to watch their backs." They continued through the tunnels, eventually reaching a vertical shaft that, according to Tommy's map, would put them right behind the enemy camp. Morrison went up first, pushing aside rotting boards to create a small opening. Through it, he could see the camp spread out below. Harrison's men were preparing for battle, checking weapons and saddles. They had no idea their commander lay dead, less than a mile away, or that their supposedly simple raid was about to turn into a nightmare. "Tommy," Morrison whispered, "get these orders to their camp. Make sure you're not seen." He handed the boy a bundle of papers wrapped in oilcloth. "Then get back to our position and wait for my signal." "What signal?" Morrison's smile was cold in the darkness. "When the shooting starts, they'll be too busy killing each other to notice us picking them off." He checked his rifle. "The colonel wanted to recreate Antietam? Well, he's about to get his wish. Only this time the ghost isn't just going to watch from a distance. As Tommy slipped away with the forged orders, Morrison positioned his remaining people carefully. Sarah would cover the east approach, where the attackers would be silhouetted against the pre-dawn sky. Pete would handle the west, using his knowledge of Harrison's tactics to predict their movements. "Remember," Morrison told them, "we're not trying to kill them all. Just make them think they're being betrayed from every direction." He patted his ammunition pouch. 20 rounds each. Make them count." The storm was building, promising the same kind of rain and chaos that had covered Antietam's battlefield. Morrison felt the old familiar calm settling over him, the sniper's patience that had made him legendary. "The colonel thought he could use my guilt to destroy me," he said softly. "Instead, he just reminded me of who I really am." He settled into position, Sharp's rifle ready. Time to show these boys what a real ghost can do. The storm broke just before midnight, turning the valley into a maze of shadows and lightning flashes. Morrison watched through his scope as confusion spread through the enemy camp. Tommy had delivered the forged orders perfectly. Now the chaos would begin. "Major Harrison!" A rider appeared through the curtain of rain. "Colonel's orders just came through. Says there's a gold shipment hidden in Box Canyon. Wants half our men to secure it before the attack." Harrison, a tall man with a cavalry officer's bearing, studied the orders by lamplight. Morrison could read the greed in his stance, the way his hands tightened on the papers. "These orders mention a specific cave," Harrison announced. "Simpson, take 20 men. Secure that gold. The rest of us will handle Morrison." His voice dropped lower, but Morrison's keen ears caught the words. "Once the gold's found, to hell. With the colonel's orders, we'll keep it all. Exactly as planned." Morrison turned to Pete, who was covering the western approach. "Watch the split. Some of those boys won't like being left out of the gold hunt." Sure enough, whispered arguments were already breaking out. Men who'd been assigned to the attack were trying to trade places with those headed for the canyon. Old rivalries surfaced, fueled by greed and rain-soaked tempers. Sarah, positioned on their left flank, reported movement in the underbrush. "They're sending scouts ahead, testing our defenses." "Let them come," Morrison murmured. "Let them think they've found our weakness." The storm intensified, bringing a darkness thick enough to cut. Lightning revealed snapshots of the enemy's preparations. Men checking weapons, horses being saddled, the glint of steel and determination. But Morrison saw something else. The subtle shifting of allegiances as Harrison's men divided their loyalties between gold and glory. Tommy returned, soaked but grinning. "Second set of orders delivered, boss. Left them where Harrison's lieutenant would find them." Morrison nodded approval. These orders, also forged, suggested that Harrison planned to claim all the gold for himself, cutting out his own men. The seeds of mistrust were planted. Now they just had to water them with blood. Through his scope, Morrison watched Harrison's force split. 20 riders headed toward Box Canyon, while the main group prepared for the attack on Shadow Creek. But there was hesitation in their movements now, uncertainty in their formation. "Boss," Pete's voice was urgent, "some of Harrison's men are hanging back, looking mighty suspicious of their own leaders." "Good." Morrison adjusted his position slightly. "When the shooting starts, they won't know who to trust. Every man will think he's being double-crossed." The first shot came from the enemy camp itself, a sharp crack that dropped one of Harrison's sergeants. Chaos erupted immediately, men diving for cover, unsure where the threat was coming from or who had fired. "Hold!" Morrison commanded his people. "Let them start it. Let them think they're being betrayed from within." More shots rang out in the darkness. Through his scope, Morrison watched Harrison trying to restore order, but the damage was done. His men were shooting at shadows, at each other, their discipline shattered by paranoia and greed. "Now," Morrison said softly, "Pete, take the left flank. Sarah, watch our back. Tommy, be ready with reload. Time to remind them why they called me the Ghost." His first shot caught a lieutenant who was trying to organize a charge. The man fell without a sound, and in the confusion, no one could tell where the bullet had come from. Morrison's second shot took down a man pointing at their position, making it seem like he was shot by his own comrades. Lightning flashed, thunder rolled, and in the chaos, the ghost of Gettysburg went to work. Each shot was carefully placed to create maximum confusion, to reinforce the impression of betrayal from within the enemy's own ranks. "Harrison's pulling back," Pete reported. "His men are refusing orders." Through the rain and darkness, Morrison allowed himself a grim smile. The colonel's army was tearing itself apart, just as planned. By dawn, they'd either run or kill each other, and the legend of the ghost would grow even larger. First light brought an eerie silence to Shadow Creek. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape shrouded in mist. Through his scope, Morrison counted the enemy dead. 12 men fallen to their own comrades' bullets, another 8 to his. Teams carefully placed shots. But Harrison had survived, and with him about 30 hard cases who'd figured out they'd been played. They'd pulled back to the canyon entrance, using the natural fortification to their advantage. The gold hunters hadn't returned, likely lost in the maze of Box Canyon's caves. "They know it was a trap now," Pete reported, studying the enemy through his binoculars. "Harrison's got them reformed, talking about making us pay." Morrison nodded. "Slowly. They'll come at us hard. No more clever plans, no more tactics, just raw hatred and numbers." He checked his ammunition. 15 rounds left for the sharps, another dozen for his revolver. Sarah appeared from her scouting position, moving like a shadow through the morning mist. "They're splitting into 3 groups. Main force with Harrison. 2 flanking elements trying to circle behind us. Classic cavalry tactic," Pete muttered. "Hit from multiple directions, overwhelm with speed." Morrison studied the terrain through his scope. The morning sun would be in the attacker's eyes, a small advantage, but he'd won battles with less. "Tommy, those mining tunnels, any of them run under their position?" 2, the boy confirmed, "but they're not stable. Whole thing could come down if—" His eyes widened with understanding. "Boss, you're not thinking, get me the dynamite from the storage shed, all of it." Morrison's voice was cold as winter steel. "They want to play their last card? Fine. We'll play ours." While Tommy fetched the explosives, Morrison outlined his plan. It was desperate, dangerous, and their only chance of survival. They'd use the tunnels one final time, placing charges at key structural points. When Harrison's men charged, they'd bring the whole canyon wall down on them. "It's suicide," Pete protested. "We'll never get the charges placed in time." "We don't have to." Morrison's eyes never left the enemy position. "Just need to collapse the main support shaft. Physics will do the rest." Sarah checked her rifle. "I'll place the charges. I'm the smallest, fastest through those tunnels." "No." Morrison's voice left no room for argument. "I need you up here. You're our best shot after me." He turned to Tommy. "You know these tunnels better than anyone. You'll have to do it." The boy straightened, pride and fear warring in his expression. "Yes, sir, but what about you? I'll give them something to shoot at. Keep their attention up here while you work." Morrison allowed himself a grim smile. Time for the ghost of Gettysburg to make his last stand. The sun climbed higher as they made their preparations. Morrison positioned his people carefully, Pete on the left, Sarah on the right, each with clear fields of fire. He took the center position, making sure he was visible enough to draw attention. Through his scope, he watched Harrison rallying. His men. The major was no fool. He'd know this was their last chance. They'd come in hard and fast, trying to overwhelm Morrison's position before he could pick them apart with rifle fire. "Remember," Morrison told his team, "when Tommy lights those charges, we'll have maybe 2 minutes to clear out. Don't wait for me. No matter what happens, you ride east the moment you hear that first explosion." "Boss," Pete started to protest. "That's an order." Morrison's voice carried the weight of every command he'd given in war. "The colonel's dead. his conspiracy exposed. The papers in my cabin will bring down every corrupt official in the territory. That's the real victory here. The sun cleared the canyon rim. Below, Harrison's men mounted up, checking weapons one final time. Morrison could feel the tension building, like the pressure before a thunderstorm. Tommy disappeared into the tunnel entrance, dynamite bundled carefully in his pack. Sarah and Pete moved to their positions, each carrying Morrison's written testimony about the conspiracy, ensuring the truth would survive even if they didn't. The first war cry echoed across the valley. Hooves thundered against packed earth as Harrison led the charge. Morrison settled his cheek against his rifle stock, letting out a slow breath. "Come on then," he whispered. "Let's give them a story worth telling." The first wave hit like a tornado. 30 riders charging uphill through the morning mist, their horses' hooves thundering against the earth. Morrison's first shot caught Harrison's standard bearer square in the chest, dropping him from the saddle. His second took down a flanking rider trying to circle left. "Make every shot count," he shouted to Pete and Sarah. Their rifles joined his, picking off riders with deadly precision. But still they came, closing the distance with savage determination. Harrison led from the front, his cavalry saber catching the sun as he urged his men forward. "Kill the ghost!" His voice boomed across the battlefield. $1,000 to the man who brings me Morrison's head." The air filled with lead as both sides exchanged fire. A bullet tugged at Morrison's sleeve, another splintered the rock beside his head. Through his scope he saw Tommy emerging from the tunnel entrance, giving the signal. Charges set. "Fall back," Morrison ordered. "Second position." They retreated in good order, just as they'd practiced. Sarah and Pete laying down covering fire, while Morrison picked off anyone who got too bold. The attackers followed, exactly as planned, pushing them toward the canyon wall. "Getting mighty close to those charges, boss," Pete warned, reloading his rifle. Morrison nodded grimly. "Tommy, light it." The boy struck a match, setting the long fuse that would trigger the dynamite charges. But before he could retreat, a shot rang out. Tommy spun, clutching his shoulder, blood spreading across his shirt. "Sniper!" Sarah screamed, spinning to return fire. Morrison's rifle was already moving, seeking the hidden shooter. There, a glint of metal in the rocks. His bullet found its mark, sending the sniper tumbling down the cliff face. But the damage was done. "Get Tommy clear," Morrison ordered Sarah. "Pete, buy us time." Harrison's men were closing in, sensing victory. Morrison counted his remaining ammunition, 6 rounds for the sharps. 3 in his revolver. Not enough to hold them all back, but maybe enough to complete Tommy's mission. "Pete, get Sarah and Tommy to safety." Morrison broke cover, drawing the attacker's fire. "I'll handle the charges." "Boss, no!" Pete protested. But Morrison was already moving, running toward the tunnel entrance. Bullets kicked up dust around his feet as he zigzagged across the open ground. Harrison spotted him, wheeling his horse around. "There he is, the ghost himself. Take him!" Morrison dove into the tunnel mouth, rolling to his feet. The fuse was still, sparking, crawling toward the charges. But it had burned too slowly. They'd need at least 5 more minutes. 5 minutes they didn't have. Above, he could hear horses approaching the tunnel entrance. Morrison drew his revolver, taking position behind a support beam. The first rider appeared in the opening, silhouetted against the morning light. Morrison's shot took him clean out of the saddle. "He's in the tunnel," someone shouted. "Flush him out!" More riders dismounted, preparing to storm the entrance. Morrison picked them off one by one, making each bullet count. But they kept coming, and he was running out of ammunition. Then he heard it. The sound that changed everything. Tommy's voice, weak but determined, calling from above. "Boss, second fuse is lit. Clear out now." The boy had crawled back, ignoring his wound, and lit a backup fuse. Morrison's heart swelled with pride, even as he calculated the odds. The new fuse would reach the charges in less than a minute. Not enough time to escape through the tunnel, but there was another way. Morrison holstered his empty revolver and unslung. His sharps, 6 rounds left, 6 chances to make history. He stepped out of the tunnel into broad daylight, rifle raised. Time seemed to slow as he took in the scene. Harrison and his remaining men, maybe 20 strong, spread out in a half-circle. All guns trained on him. "So," Harrison called out, "the ghost shows himself at last." Morrison's rifle barked, the bullet catching Harrison's lieutenant between the eyes. "5," he muttered, working the action. The air erupted with gunfire. Morrison spun, his second shot dropping a man trying to flank him. 4. A bullet grazed his ribs, another his thigh. But still he stood, still he shot. 3 more men fell to his rifle, each shot placed with the same deadly accuracy that had made him legendary. "1 round left," he announced to the stunned survivors. "Who wants it?" Harrison himself answered, spurring his horse forward, saber raised. Morrison's last bullet caught him square in the chest, throwing him backward from the saddle. Then the ground began to shake. Tommy's fuse had reached the charges. The canyon wall groaned as tons of rock shifted above. Morrison's trap was sprung. "Run!" someone screamed, but it was too late. The first explosion triggered a chain reaction. The canyon wall collapsed, bringing down a thundering avalanche of rock and earth. Morrison dove clear as the entrance to the tunnel disappeared under tons of debris, taking half of Harrison's men with it. The dust slowly settled to reveal a changed landscape. Where Harrison's force had stood, there was now a wall of rubble. The survivors fled in panic, their nerve broken by the display of destructive power. Morrison stood, favoring his wounded leg. Sarah appeared from her hidden position, supporting a bandaged Tommy. Pete emerged from the rocks, rifle still smoking. "Reckon that's the end of the Colonel's army," Pete said quietly. Morrison nodded, looking at the devastation. The end of more than that. The end of a war that should have finished years ago. He turned to survey what remained of Shadow Creek. Buildings damaged by artillery, fields torn up by hooves and bullets. But still standing, still his. "Tommy," he said, "ride to town. Tell the sheriff's deputy what happened here. Tell him we've got proof of the conspiracy, proof that'll hang a lot of important men." He paused, looking at the rising sun. "Tell him the ghost of Gettysburg is finally done with killing." As Tommy rode off, Morrison felt the weight of years lifting from his shoulders. The Colonel, Harrison, all the ghosts of his past, buried beneath tons of Texas rock. His brother's death at Antietam would always haunt him, but maybe now he could begin to forgive himself. "What now, boss?" Pete asked. Morrison slung his empty rifle over his shoulder. Now we rebuild. And make sure Shadow Creek stays what it was meant to be, a place where a man's worth is measured by his character, not his skill with a gun." The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist. Somewhere in the distance, cattle began to low, reminding them that life went on. The war was over. The ghost could finally rest. A month after the battle, Morrison stood on his porch at sunset, watching his cattle graze in the restored pastures. The signs of war were fading, buildings repaired, fences mended, ground smoothed over. But the memories remained, etched in. The land, like the Colonel's bullets in his cabin walls, the conspiracy's unraveling had shaken the territory. Judge Harrison, Mayor Wade, and a dozen other officials now sat in federal custody, awaiting trial. The evidence Morrison had gathered, combined with the Colonel's detailed records, had exposed corruption, reaching all the way to the state capitol. Tommy, his arm healing well, rode up, leading a string of horses. The boy had earned his place as Shadow Creek's newest full hand, his courage during the battle proving him worthy of the trust Morrison had placed in him. "Mail from town, boss," Tommy called out, handing up a bundle of letters. "Sheriff's deputy says the federal marshal wants your testimony at the trials next month." Morrison nodded, but his attention was on a different letter, one bearing an Illinois postmark. He'd written to his father's old nurse after the battle, seeking the truth about his parentage. Her response confirmed everything. His father's brief romance before the war, the son he'd never known about, the terrible coincidence that had led to brother killing brother at Antietam. "Also," Tommy added, Sarah Matthews is back from her aunt's place. Says she's ready to take over her pa's medical practice. A ghost of a smile crossed Morrison's weathered face. Sarah had proven herself during the fight, her courage matching her compassion. Doc Matthews would have been proud to see his daughter following in his footsteps, healing the community's wounds, just as she'd helped heal Shadow Creek's defenders. Pete approached from the barn, his spurs jingling. "Cattle's looking good, boss. Reckon we'll have the best herd in 3 counties by spring." "Reckon so," Morrison agreed. He'd sold his Sharps rifle to a collector back east, using the money to buy new breeding stock. Shadow Creek would prosper. By raising life now, not dealing death. The sun painted the canyon walls gold, the same walls that had become a tomb for the colonel's army. Local folk were already telling stories about the battle, embellishing the tale with each telling. The ghost of Gettysburg had become a legend in Texas now, too. But Morrison knew the real story wouldn't be found in those tales. It lay in the quiet moments. Tommy learning to read by lamplight, Sarah tending to injured ranch hands, Pete teaching young cowboys the right way to work cattle. Shadow Creek had become what he'd always hoped it would be. Not just a ranch, but a home. He touched the pocket where he kept his father's letter to William, the one the boy had tried to deliver at Antietam. The colonel had preserved it all these years, and now it helped Morrison understand both his brother's sacrifice and his own path to redemption. "Sun's setting, boss," Tommy observed. "Want me to light the evening lamps?" Morrison shook his head. "No need, boy. The shadows don't trouble me anymore." And they didn't. The ghost of Gettysburg had finally found peace in the Texas twilight, his war truly over at last. Shadow Creek would prosper, its future built not on violence and revenge, but on the strength of those who'd chosen to make it their home. As darkness settled over the valley, Morrison heard the dinner bell ring. Cookie's voice carried across the yard, calling his people home. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to build rather than destroy. But for now, in this moment, all was right in his world. The ghost could finally rest, and James Morrison, rancher, leader, and brother, could live.